Hello and welcome to Dateline London. Syria. Now Russia has joined in with bombs, and in a week dominated in British politics by Labour's new leader, Jeremy Corbyn, what are the big challenges ahead for the Conservatives as they prepare for 5 more years? My guests today are Mustafa Karkuti of Gulf News, Nabila Ramdani, who's a French-Algerian writer, Stephanie Baker of Bloomberg Markets, and Polly Toynbee of The Guardian. Very good to see you all. While Russia intervened in the Syrian conflict this week by attacking forces opposed to President Assad's regime, though precisely which forces were targeted is a matter of dispute. Is it time for the West to work with rather than against Putin? And does the Syrian conflict have any possible resolution? You're from Syria, you've seen your homeland destroyed over the past few years, Mustafa. Do you think it's time for the West to work, cooperate more with Putin?
Well, they should have started that, in fact, long time ago. Since 2011, 2012. They have left it for far too late, I guess. And I think, in the first place, the Western response originally was inadequate. The bombing, let's say, is really inadequate. Now the Russian bombing is much more inadequate. It's much worse, if you like. Certainly, one of the main aims of the Russian adventure at the moment is to shore up President Assad and help him stay in power as long as possible. And as we've seen over the last 3-4 days of Russian bombings, they are doing, let us say, 5 bombing on those on targets who opponents of Assad himself. The local, of course, the Syrian, the opposition, while maybe targeting once or twice ISIL. So certainly the Russian also have other aims. They are fighting for their own survival in the region itself.
You mean their political survival?
Political survival. The Russian, they have a naval base in Tartus. Is the only naval base they have outside Russia. They have no other where in the world. So this is strategically vital for them. Also, the land base in Latakia, further north, is also of vital interest for the Russian. So they are fighting for their own survival in the region and also
as well. And Nabila, I mean, simplifying greatly, but the Moscow analysis appears to be you've got a choice between stability and chaos. And Assad is stability and everybody else is bringing chaos. So they're all the same. I mean, Islamic State may be the worst of the worst, but all the others are lumped together. I mean, that seems to be broadly their analysis. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's far more complicated than that. And I think we should all rightly be very concerned when Russia goes to war. And this is especially so in the case of Putin's Russia. And of course, when we're dealing with a massively muddled war zone like Syria, Putin is clearly interested in keeping some sort of Russian influence in the Middle East through his links with President Bashar al-Assad, and conveniently make out that he's finally joining the war against global terrorism. Everybody despises ISIS, and so Putin can push his PR about being involved in a bold stand against barbaric extremism. The reality is, I mean, whether we should work with Putin or not, I think foreign policy, and in particular international diplomacy, is all about making those cynical alliances at times, and we should be very pragmatic about it. And that has always been the case about foreign policy. It's always driven by self-interest in the end, and you have to get your hands dirty and engage. But my concerns about this pragmatic view about foreign policy is that Putin seems to be far more interested in bombing pro-democracy rebels opposing Assad than he is ISIS. And this is clearly very worrying. I think what Putin is hoping to achieve by joining the coalition of allegedly civilized nations fighting terror is that he can not only negotiate with the West, but actually win Western support and thus end his isolation, especially when it comes to other aspects of his policy, and particularly in the Ukraine.
And Stephanie, how is this seen in the United States? Because there are those, and they include some of President Obama's critics who say he has left a vacuum in world leadership. That's the usual critique that's made by some in the Republican Party. And it's hardly surprising if the Russians or some other people step in.
Yeah, I mean, U.S. policy on Syria has been a disaster. Nothing has worked. And so Putin waltzing in looks like a bold move and perhaps will change the balance of power on the ground. But I think the response you saw from Obama last night and what American officials have been saying finally in reaction to this shows that they think this is going to backfire on Putin, that this will cause terrorist attacks within Russia, and they're playing on Putin's fear. And Putin is obviously going into this because he has his own battles with Islamic extremism within Russia, in the North Caucasus. There are a lot of Russian citizens, by some accounts, thousands fighting with ISIS in Syria. So if you look at it from, the problem is that Putin's worldview is very different from the U.S. worldview. Putin's aim is very clear. He's there to prop up Assad. It's part of the Putin doctrine, which is that state sovereignty is sort of sacrosanct, even if it means supporting brutal dictators who maim their own citizens. The U.S. can't agree, they can't be seen to be backing Assad. There's no way to come up with a political solution to the war in Syria if Assad is at the table. So it's very unclear how this is going to pan out. It will change the balance of power on the ground. There's no doubt about that. Will that force Assad to the negotiating table? It's hard to say.
Polly, I mean, I'm just thinking of your readers sitting at home reading The Guardian, and they think, I'd love to do something about Syria. This is a humanitarian catastrophe. Look at all these poor refugees and immigrants. What would be that something, given the nature of this mess now? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has suggested any bombing would be getting into a 5-way civil war. Others say if we don't do something militarily, we can never solve it.
I think Russia's entry into it has changed the nature of the game totally for Britain, because we were about to have very soon a vote in the Commons. Cameron was going to bring it forward, partly as a provocation to split Labour. Some Labour people, the moderates, would have wanted to join Cameron and say, yes, we must, it's our moral responsibility to get involved. We should show we're standing, as we always do, standing alongside the United States, and if they want us to come in and join the bottom, we should. I think that's totally gone away. I hear now that Cameron has suggested that there is not going to be any vote anytime soon. There are at least 30 Conservative MPs who would vote against, so he hasn't got a majority. He needs some of those Labour moderates to come across. I don't think any of them would now, partly because the idea of precision bombing we've seen today is Kunduz. We've seen in Kunduz
where people have been killed.
Yes, I mean, the Americans try their best. I think Obama really tries seriously not to kill civilians, but you always do. And when you have a horror like a hospital being killed that had actually told the Americans where they were, plainly an accident, the idea of precision bombing, let alone the fact that Putin's motives may actually be to hit the pro-democratic side as opposed to the ISIS side, makes the whole pool so murky. Why would we, with our few pathetic bombs, purely a token gesture, say, oh, we want to go in there and drop some bombs too? It doesn't really matter where. I think we rather like the idea of bombing Raqqa. I think that's what we've got our eye on. What on earth is that about? I don't think there'd be any public support for it unless there was a purpose, we were contributing something, and there was an exit strategy with some form of peace at the end, of which we see nothing. But what you are seeing across Europe is growing cynicism. Frankly, peace at any price. The refugee situation is now so appalling that we'll sit down with almost anybody. If it means Assad's got to stay, if it means making peace with the Russians, so be it. I feel that's the undertone. Nobody's quite saying that, but I think that's the direction that it's moving in.
Yeah, Mustafa?
Eventually, I think events will go down this route anyhow, but do not limit the crisis to what just the Russians are doing and the coalition is doing. There are some other regional powers extremely involved in this tragedy itself. Iran, for example, through its Hezbollah, they are doing a lot of bad things in the country.
What about Saudi Arabia? Because
I'm coming to that. So if you want to move ahead towards any, I wouldn't say solution, because in my view, unfortunately, the solution for Syria will take very, very long time, maybe decades, not years. You have to bring in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran into the whole pot itself, with the Russian, of course, and start talking. What the hell, which piece of this cake you want? I mean,
Nabila, is it too cynical to think that there are some people for whom there's a great benefit in just keeping this going?
Well, I think, as Mustafa rightly said, it's very hard to see any solution anytime soon, and certainly not in the short term, because there are so many sides involved and so much hatred involved. I think one of the problems is also due to the fact that the West and its allies, America specifically and its allies, have a very focused view of the problem, and they see ISIS as a very specific problem, while perhaps overlooking the wider picture in the region. And groups, extremist groups, the emergence of extremist groups like ISIS, actually were brought by the intense violence that the Americans and its allies brought to countries like Iraq and indeed Libya.
And also the power vacuum that was there, in particular the Sunni areas.
Which nasty groups exploit to a sinister level. But until America and its allies keep looking at this problem, answering intense violence with intense violence that they created in the first place, then
What about safe havens? They keep talking about perhaps we can create safe havens. Is there any realism in that at all, do you think?
Well, I think there is. I think at the end of the day, they are going to create safe havens, not only one in the north, along the Turkish borders, everywhere else, in the south as well.
But somebody has to defend them to make them safe. That's always the catch, isn't it?
Well,
Srebrenica in 1993, safe haven, people were killed because it wasn't properly defended. And I don't see any appetite from people to go in and actually defend them. They'd love to have them if somebody else would protect them. That's the catch, isn't it?
It would decrease the amount of agony and tragedy in the country.
But would you need the UN then, troops?
Well,
the UN doesn't have the money or the forces any
If
longer.
anything, look at what Putin has done. He has actually created his own safe haven for the naval base that they are. And it shows how it is possible to do it.
Well, as long as it's a naval base. Right, let's move on, because David Cameron went into the May general election in Britain promising that he would not serve out a full term. So, with the Labour Party still coming to terms with their great defeat, have the Conservatives, who are meeting in their annual conference, moved on to celebrating a Cameron victory to planning for his successor? Is that what they're doing? It's all plots, is it, do you think?
Oh, it's endless positioning, and it's very difficult because sometimes Cameron says, well, I'm going to stay until the very end. They've got to get over the referendum first. So all of those people positioning themselves are wondering on which side of the referendum to place
This is
themselves.
the European Union
European referendum, which could be next year or has to be by the year after. So key players like Boris Johnson, he's keeping his powder dry as to which side, maybe he'll be pro-European, maybe anti-European. I think that sort of cynicism will explode in his face. People say, look, you must have a belief. But he appears to be very malleable. Then, of course, there's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, who is by far the front runner at the moment. He seems to be making the economy go well. We could have disputes about that, but apparently so. Seems to be very popular with his party, has made this great bid for the Northern powerhouse, for re-engaging the North with the Conservatives. So he'd be a very hot front runner. Top woman would be Home Secretary Theresa May. She's a bit of an ice queen. Suddenly, in comes the Education Secretary. They're all at it. So at the conference, there will be a lot of positioning going on.
Oh, well, that's one of the reasons why journalists go to these conferences. It's not to listen to the speeches. What do you make of it? I mean, David Cameron, he should be going into a big triumph, shouldn't he? Because nobody expected, I don't think he even expected to win the election the way he did. He did do so. He's got a clear mandate for another 5 years, and yet apparently he's going to quit just before the end. Somewhat like the England football team, rugby team playing Wales, actually, one might think. But anyway, what do you make of it?
Well, obviously, I think Osborne is the front runner at this stage. I mean, we saw him as these, globe-trotting statesmen in China, drumming up business for UK PLC. The economy's going incredibly well, fastest growing major advanced economy set to be for the third year running. But there is danger being an early front runner. Just look at Hillary Clinton in the US, or even Jeb Bush, both of whom are having a very hard time after having been anointed the sort of, the early front runners. His main challenge is the EU referendum. He's the head of the campaign strategy on the referendum. He's head of negotiations with the EU. And there's a whole aspect of that that could spin out of his control. He's not in control of that. It's impossible. You know, the migrant crisis could get even worse. Greece could blow up again. You know, there's been some news this week that they think that actually European leaders are warming to Britain's proposals on reform of the EU because of the migrant crisis. But
they have political credibility at home to look at as well. So the idea that Merkel or Hollande or anybody is going to be all that malleable is a bit difficult, because France has interests and Germany has interests, whoever's in power, really.
Right, and there are just so many moving parts, and how do you get treaty change? So I think, you know, Osborne has stuck his neck out on this one. I think there's probably a lot more, from what I gather, a lot more behind-the-scenes negotiations going on this that they're not letting on. They do not want to show their cards too early. But if he's able to pull this off, then I think it's quite clear that he's the anointed.
But there is only one thing that he really needs, which is to end free movement of labour, and he's not going to get it because the Eastern Europeans will never concede it.
Well, I think maybe with the East Europeans having to contend with their own migrant crisis, maybe the feeling is maybe they're looking at this slightly differently.
Maybe
I agree.
free movement of people defined differently might strike a chord with some of them.
Possibly.
But when it comes to David Cameron, you know, we learn in life that you never believe politicians. They can change their mind at the end of the day. If he's saying he's staying only one term or this term, he may change in view of the success, the Conservatives.
Well, he may feel, as politicians have in the past, that the unanimous view of the British people is that I am needed to stay.
Public demand.
The public is demanding it. I would rather go off, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'm saying, yeah, it could. Especially there is no serious opposition, really. Not, at least, I'm not talking the party. Labour is really getting weaker and weaker. We had first Ed Miliband, who led the party into disaster. He lost so many seats in the election. He wasn't a brilliant leader at all. Followed by Corbyn, whom I like. He's an honest person, lovely man. But does he have the quality of a leadership which can revive and unite the Labour Party? With only 20 MPs voting for him out of 232 Labour MPs, I'm doubtful.
Nabila.
Well, my own view is that there are as many Labour Party politicians who are as keen to choose a new leader as there are in the Tories, frankly. Much as I admire Jeremy Corbyn for numerous different reasons, I think he's going to have immense difficulty launching a serious general election challenge. A lot of people have written him off as a serious prime ministerial candidate, not least of all within his own ranks. The Conservatives are very much aware of this, and they are certainly going to plan for the future. Cameron has already expressed his retirement plans already, and colleagues like George Osborne are sizing up their chances of succeeding him. We're also hearing of Nicky Morgan wanting to become the next Maggie Thatcher. Well, dream on. And then Boris Johnson is referred to as the people's choice. This is a rather exceptional situation, and especially so early in parliamentary terms. I mean, politicians in government are usually so consumed with the job in hand that, you know, they're not planning ahead. And I think it's Harold Wilson who said a week in politics is a long time, and yet we have politicians in government speculating years ahead. This is very dangerous for democracy.
Before we move on, do you buy into the idea that we're in the time of a new politics? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn says that repeatedly. Do you think we're in new politics, or is it just sort of the old politics that's falling apart?
Well, for it to be the new politics, Jeremy Corbyn would have to prove that he can reach out beyond people who are already left-leaning. He's done incredibly well in pulling people to the Labour Party who are non-voters or students or young people, the alienated, but they're all left-leaners. There is no polling, not that we necessarily believe polls these days after the election, but there is no polling evidence that a single voter has switched the line the other way. He needs to get some of those Conservative voters in key seats without which he can't win, and there is no evidence of that.
Now, let's end with President Obama, because he said that the mass shootings in the United States have become, unfortunately, routine. He's obviously right in this because we report them week after week, but should we assume that for many people in the United States, the repeated massacre of innocent people is somehow acceptable, an acceptable level of deaths in order to ensure that gun owners are free to buy more or less what they like. I mean, how do you see this? Because Obama, in his own way, somewhat professorial way, was clearly really quite angry.
I know. I've never seen him that emotional. I think that was his 15th public response against, in the aftermath of a mass shooting. He's completely powerless. It was clear. I mean, he said thoughts and prayers won't do it. I mean, I think there's a real level of frustration. And what can he do? I mean, this is such an intractable problem in the U.S. The NRA has the National Rifle Association has so much money to channel into the election process, backing certain congressmen and senators, that it's just impossible to get any gun control, even the most modest gun control laws passed in Congress. It's become. I struggle to explain it to the outside world as if there is some magic kind of secret that will kind of explain why Americans believe in holding guns. But I just can't. There's no explanation.
Right.
Well, speaking for the outside world, I'd say that it's one of the reasons why a lot of people in the outside world always regard America as being certifiably insane, or a large section of it, that there is this deeply divided society in America, part of which is incredibly clever, sophisticated, like Obama, sort of brilliant and astute and ahead of the game. And then there is this Neanderthal part, which is incomprehensible, violent, aggressive, self-hating, extraordinary. And I think part of America's problem abroad is these regular confirmations of the damage it does to itself.
But the question I've often asked Americans who are very, very strongly in favour of gun control is, what are you frightened of that you need so many guns? I mean, I can understand, most British people could understand if you were in the American West and you're miles from anywhere, you might want to hunt or something like that. That's not the issue.
It's an emblem. It's who I am. It's me, my guns, my rights, quite often my Christianity, all in one unpleasant pool.
To pick up on this point, really, we as Arabs, let's say, we find it really perplexing sometimes, the division between the Congress and the White House itself. I mean, the lobby system.
And the inability of presidents to do
things.
I
mean, take the Palestine issue. It has not been progressing at all for at least 3-4 days. Well, through its history, because of the lobby system in the States. They just control the president.
Well, part of it is that members of the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years.
Yeah.
So unlike senators who've got some time to reflect and grow into the job, if you're facing re-election every 2 years, you actually listen to not just lobbyists, but your constituents. I mean, that's
right.
What's said in favour of the American system.
Yeah, what I find particularly shocking is that statistically, gun violence in America is the equivalent of a Tunisia beach attack every day of the week. Statistically, and yet nothing is done about it. And Stephanie is right. Obama is powerless about it because the NRA hold all the cards, and there's nothing that can be done to get in the way of their profits.
How long do you think before we will see ads saying Hillary wants to take away my guns as part of the presidential election campaign, or whoever the candidate is? Bernie Sanders wants to take away my guns.
Inevitable, and that is the key. The key solution here is campaign finance reform. If the NRA continues to have such financial sway over who gets the nomination, who gets elected, it's a foregone conclusion. We will not have gun control in the
How
US.
bizarre it seems to us that you elect someone like President Obama twice, this huge razzmatazz. Who is going to be the President of the United States? And then he has no power to do almost anything.
Clinton tried it as well, didn't he?
He tried it too. He had very few powers.
What I found particularly astonishing is that, terrorist attacks are given so much prominence that billions of dollars are found to combat them, and yet atrocities on a daily basis like that are happening, and nothing can be done about it, it seems.
Well, we'll leave it there, but somehow I think we're going to talk about it again. Anyway, that's it for Dateline London for this week. You can comment on the programme on Twitter. We're back next week at the same time. Please make a date with Dateline. Thanks for watching and goodbye.